Hello, listeners. Welcome back. Thank you for joining me again today. And the topic of conversation today is obviously going to be leadership, because it always is. However, what's interesting about this episode is that we're going to be looking at it through a different lens. One of the things that most successful entrepreneurs, senior leaders, CEOs, those big executives have in common is that they employ or work with an executive assistant. So today I'm joined by Ethan Bull. He's the co-founder of Pro Assisting, and they're a company, an agency effectively, for placing executive assistants in your business. And the reason this is an interesting lens to look at leadership through is because of all of the different parts of the business that an executive assistant will get involved in. They will be working so closely with that top leadership. They will see everything. And so Ethan, from his career of over 20 years as an executive assistant, has some really interesting insights and perspectives to share with us about leadership. And of course, we're also going to hear about his business, how it works, and he's going to offer some advice for any of you who may be either as a business owner looking to work with an executive assistant, or perhaps as a new manager or an early career starter, someone who's looking for that next step, or even a change of career, if you might want to get into the field of executive assisting. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I hope you all enjoy it. This is Leading with Integrity, Leadership Talk, the podcast for first-time managers who are working in tech-driven businesses and teams and who want to be more effective, people-first leaders. Each week, you will learn the crucial strategies, mindsets, and practical tips that successful modern leaders follow to be engaging, ethical, and authentic managers who get the best from their teams. And we'll achieve all of this via weekly conversations with leaders, with leadership experts, entrepreneurs, and business owners, people who have already walked this path and have some amazing insights to share, with an added sprinkling of occasional solo episodes and some group chats where we'll have multiple guests. My name is David Hatch, and I will be your host. And leadership has always been a passion for me. After a career spent in a series of small businesses during 15 years in the aerospace industry, 5 or 6 of those at the end of that career were in a space startup in the UK, so trying to launch satellites into orbit, very cool stuff. And through all of that experience, I learned that the secret to successful management is in the ability to apply great leadership. And in turn, the secret to great leadership, it's all about your integrity, putting people before profits.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Ethan, thank you for getting up a bit early to join me today. Much appreciated. It's great to have you on the show.
David, thank you for having me.
Well, you're very welcome. As I say, it's lovely to have you. So I'm going to take the risk I always take at the beginning of every episode and just completely hand the reins and the virtual mic over to you, the guest, to introduce yourself, tell the listeners a bit about what you do, what your business does, and what gets you out of bed in the morning.
Sure. My name is Ethan Bull. I am a career top-level executive assistant. My experience started back in the 90s, working in entertainment, in a number of roles. I ended that portion of my career serving the chairman of USA Films when we were making the movie Traffic by Steven Soderbergh. I then transitioned into supporting the chief operating officer of a $1 billion ad agency on Madison Avenue in New York City for about 13, 14 years. And before making the transition to our own business, my wife and I moved out of New York City and into upstate New York, which is about 6 hours north of the city. And I was director of admin services and executive assistant to the chief operating officer for a healthcare network that was doing $2 billion in revenue and had 16,000 employees. As director of admin services for them, I led a team of about 80 assistants supporting 250 executives. And then back in 2018, my wife and I decided to launch our own business, and that is Pro Assisting, and we provide fractional remote executive assistant support to business leaders, C-suite executives, entrepreneurs, startup CEOs, non-executive board directors. And we've really positioned Pro Assisting to kind of fit in that space between where kind of a virtual assistant would end and a full-time assistant would pick up. And we saw a gap in the market there. And in terms of what gets me out of bed in the morning, I would say it's my kids being loud and running around with the dog downstairs, which rouses me and gets me up. But I don't know if that's what you were actually asking about.
Well, I mean, that's the practical reality, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Fair enough. Yeah. For some people, it's like their purpose in life is to get up to do that. But,
I am more of a night owl. I'm on the night owl side, and I enjoy my sleep, much to my wife's chagrin.
Yes. Fair. I can certainly empathize with that. Yeah. Quite an interesting variation of industries you've worked in then. So you've literally lived in the world of Mad Men then, give or take a decade or two.
Yeah. At the ad agency, there were a couple of bottles of whiskey stored away in some drawers for celebratory occasions. And, I do look at entertainment and advertising as kind of kindred spirits, if you will, in terms of industry. But frankly, from our perspective, being a great executive assistant to a business leader, it's really industry agnostic as well as principle agnostic.
I kind of see leadership the same way, actually. It's, I talk about it as a universal skill, but interested to pick in a little bit into the terminology, if you like, and start by defining like what we actually mean by an executive assistant and how that's different to virtual assistants, which is obviously something that's become super popular and everyone has one in the last few years for obvious reasons. So what makes an executive assistant different?
Well, I go back to 2007 when Tim Ferriss came out with the book, The 4-Hour Workweek, and really popularized the term virtual assistant. And what he meant was hiring a VA overseas, looking at the $5 per hour variety that can manage systems and tasks while you're sleeping, if you will, to run your business. We look at top level executive assistant as really taking that and putting it on steroids, if you will. One way to describe how we do what we do is kind of being a 5-star hotel concierge in the cloud that knows everything about you. And a top level executive assistant through our methodology really handles 5 verticals. 1 being a business partner, 2 being a project manager, 3 being a chief of staff, 4 being an assistant / scheduler, and the last one is being a personal assistant. Anything that an executive assistant can do to keep things off of a principal's plate, take things off of their plate, or be that single point of contact to save them time. That's the name of the game, is a win. And, to have that kind of interaction, you really need to spend the time to form a true partnership relationship built on trust. And in the beginning, be synchronous in terms of building that relationship. With a virtual assistant, it's more what we found task-based, and the communication turnaround time can vary widely. And from an executive assistant standpoint, that turnaround time when you can let a principal know that you'll be able to speak to them, get back to them with an answer is kind of paramount. And we take that into account in our business model.
I very much like the comparison to the concierge. That's a really, really cool way of putting it. Thank you. Your business kind of places executive assistants, I guess, and they work for your company and then you contract them out. Is that right? Have I understood that correctly?
We're an agency.
Yeah.
And they don't work for us. They are independent contractors who create a business under our umbrella, if you will. And the unique thing about us is one of the unique things is that since Stephanie and I are part of the EA community, we really didn't align with the compensation structure of the virtual assistant side of the business, of the industry, if you will. And so we pass 80% of our retainers onto our partner executive assistants. So they're compensated appropriately based on their experience. And that allows them to have consistent compensation, do great work, and be partnered for the long term, even though our agreements are month to month.
Yeah. So everyone's a winner then, ideally.
That's the goal.
Amazing. Yeah. And so when you started setting up the business, what's been the biggest obstacle that you've had to overcome in that process?
I think it's that fear or that uncertainty on if you're going to get that first and second client. We placed a pretty big bet with an outside sales team to schedule 5 calls a month for 3 months. And that cost us $2,000 a month for 5 phone calls. And it was scary because I wasn't a salesman. We were still finding our way in terms of the business model and what exactly would work. But out of those 15 calls, we landed 2 long-term clients that one is still with us to this day, over 5 years later. And the other was with us for almost 4 years. And the return on investment was like 50x and climbing. So we were very fortunate in terms of getting in front of those people through the persistence of that company. But I think anytime you're starting a business, getting those first couple of paying customers to actually validate that what you're doing is worth paying for is a huge obstacle. And that was it for us. I will say we weren't prepared or didn't realize that when you move from being a full-time employee to a business owner, there is an inherent level of stress even to this day when things are going perfectly, because you are always the end all be all, and you're the one getting those emails or phone calls of something going wrong, losing a client, a prospect deciding not to go with you. And you need to have the right mindset to say to yourself, we're not for everyone. This too shall pass. And if we're persistent and patient enough and we can play the long game, we will win.
Yeah, definitely. There's certainly some familiar parts of that story. I think any business owner will identify with a lot of that. I think I was talking to someone about this yesterday, actually, and this kind of dynamic where, particularly for service-based business owners and like owner-operators, solopreneurs, that kind of thing, it's the sales piece is something we all really seem to struggle with. And I think that's because we're very focused on the service, the thing that we do. And that's our expertise. That's in most of our cases what we've always done. And so to suddenly be in a position where you've got to pick up this new skill set that you've never had to use before, you've never needed. And I think that's why it becomes such a big obstacle for so many business owners. Clearly you found the shortcut through.
I think having the expertise and doing something that you are very confident in your ability and skills, as opposed to starting a service-based business that you've never done before. goes a long way. And I took some sales training that was considered consultative sales training, where you're not trying to make a sale because you are looking for long-term relationships. And it's more about getting to know the answer of no than the answer of yes. Because if you can get to the answer no quick enough, meaning you're not the right fit for the person you're talking to, you get to focus more on people that will potentially get to a yes. And it's hard in the beginning because you need to put food on the table. No doubt about it. That is paramount. But you also don't want to waste time, your energy, your effort into getting to a yes on someone who isn't truly right for you, and then either walks away from the experience saying that was not a good service, or just realizes you guys aren't the right fit and you've wasted all that time.
Yeah, that's the other side of the coin, isn't it? Is knowing when to say no. And you're right, particularly in your early days, you feel that pressure to say yes to any business because you don't know where the next bit might come from. And as you say, you've got to put food on the table. And yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, the two sides of that coin, isn't it?
Really. And as we've grown, I've become much better at saying no, or not saying no, but guiding prospects to a different option, to a different outcome. And I feel just as good getting off of a prospect call when I point someone to a different service or tell them that you really need a full-time assistant, as opposed to working with us. Because I honestly think that that's kind of karma. It's going to come around in the positive on the other side. And as long as that person leaves the conversation, knows that I was a straight shooter and treated them right, they will look back on us fondly and potentially recommend us to someone who maybe is the right fit.
That's it. Yeah. And it's, as you said earlier, it's the long term versus the short term, isn't it? And yeah, absolutely. Well, let's change direction slightly with the next question, which is, what's the best thing about what you do?
I really get a lift out of knowing that we're knocking it out of the park for a client, and that they are doing better with their business and, frankly, their life by being partnered with one of our assistants. I also get a great lift by helping an executive assistant transition from working for a single employer in a full-time role to kind of crafting their own lifestyle and business, and making that transition. And that has been a real interesting aspect of the last 5.5 years of running Pro Assisting and taking people through that process, and having assistants say, I don't think I could ever work for one person ever again, or I don't think I could ever be a full-time employee ever again. We kind of put training wheels on those assistants' business and take a lot of or all of the sales, the marketing, the agreements, the insurance, the invoicing, the collections off their plate, so they can just focus on doing what they do. But yet then they also get the benefits of running a business and writing off business expenses and scheduling their day in a way that suits them, and creating those long-term partnerships with clients, and having that 5-degree shift of thinking of themselves as a business versus an employee. And some of our assistants have gone on to partner with other assistants under them and grow their business. And that gives me great pride as well.
I can imagine. And it's something I think we could benefit from in a lot more industries, because as you say, the training wheels, you're kind of taking out a lot of the biggest risks of setting out on your own, aren't you? Because as you say, you're introducing it to customers, you're covering all of those overhead liabilities, whatever you want to call them. And Yeah, I mean, that must be really powerful for someone who's looking for a different career path, a different way of working. Perhaps they've had enough of working for bosses.
Well, I will say a lot of the assistants that we partner with have to be located within large metropolitan areas to get into that 6-figure compensation range. And I still have not found another remote support company or a virtual assistant company that compensates their EAs like we do, which gives them the ability to move outside of those major metropolitan areas and live where they want to live, not based on population density, which gets them those higher level roles.
And so to what extent is there crossover between the virtual and the executive parts of that assistant role? Do you place people exclusively who are working remotely or exclusively on premises or a combination thereof, or how does that work?
Our service is all remote.
Okay.
I have served as a recruiter in a few instances over the last 5 years. I don't want to be in a position where I'm telling a potential employer, this is really the perfect assistant for you, when I don't fully believe it because I'm looking to get paid. There's nothing wrong with recruiters. They serve a valuable niche and everything, but that's just not for me, because I want to be as confident as possible in any recommendation I make. And I don't want that to be based on me getting paid a recruiting fee. So, we focus solely on remote. In 2018, 2019, when I was having those first conversations, I had to do a lot of explaining around what remote work was and how remote work worked. And then after COVID, that all went away. And I think it's been really interesting to see how that has evolved. And I think we'll get into this later, but, life is shades of gray from my perspective. And you hear a lot of remote work is the only way of the future. And then you hear a lot of remote work is terrible and it's never going to work. And I'm just like, listen, it's a shade of gray. So yeah, that's where I see us being right now. Artificial intelligence also plays a role there too. Like artificial intelligence is going to take every single job, and artificial intelligence is just a fad. And no, it's definitely somewhere in the middle.
I tend to agree with you on both of those, actually. It's why I quite like this idea of hybrid and flexible work, and particularly as a leader, giving your people the opportunity to work in a way that suits them, whether that's a couple of days in the office to have the social aspect, or fully remote, or other scale if they want to work full time in the office. Give them that opportunity. I think where companies tend to go wrong with that stuff, I think, is when they decide for everyone and then try to impose it as a policy. And I think we've seen a couple of quite high profile examples, certain well-known phone companies and software houses that have done that quite badly wrong.
Well, I find it a bit rich when Elon Musk is in an interview on CNBC, and he's the Tesla factory floor is behind him, and he's saying, yeah, remote work is not going to work. We need these factory workers in the factory building the car. I'm like, of course you do. No one is debating that. That's not the debate. But does your bookkeeper need to be in the office to record accounts payable and accounts receivable? No. So it's that absolutism that kind of gets my back up a little bit sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting you mentioned him as well, because of course Twitter, before he bought it, I would have said was one of the ones who were getting it right. And I assume, I haven't seen any headlines to say this explicitly, but I assume since he's bought it, their policy's been thrown out the window and everyone's gone back to the office.
Well, I don't know if he even codified the policy, but he did let go a big chunk of the workforce. And I'm sure, being on site in presence potentially had something to do with that. But again, I'm in the cheap seats, just watching from afar. So I do not have all the information.
Yeah, exactly. No, same. It's easy to be the armchair expert, isn't it?
Right.
The
It
keyboard
is.
warrior and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, I don't know. To an extent, I see where he's coming from. I think it's got to fit the role, hasn't it? But if we're
Yeah.
talking about office roles, which we were, it's not the same, is it?
One thing I am saying to assistants that I'm mentoring, coaching, and something that we don't do with pro assisting is, let's say an assistant lives in Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville, Tennessee isn't a major metropolitan area, but it's a significant metropolitan area. And I think that targeted hybrid remote executive assistant support is a unique niche that closes the circle of who that potential assistant could partner with, gives them an opportunity to have FaceTime and actually create that real, more than a real Zoom relationship with them, and also allows them to do some targeted things in person that really then open up the benefits and the value of partnering with someone like that. It's just an idea. There is something to be said for looking at what we do in more of a hybrid aspect. It's just that as an overall company, we can't provide that.
It's the flexibility as well, isn't it? And you're trying to avoid pinning yourself to geographical areas. Yeah, I totally get it. It's a bigger marketplace as well that way. I think that's one of the big advantages of COVID, though, isn't it? It's opened up to so many businesses a much more global market.
Better talent, no geographical boundaries.
Digital nomad and all of that sort of thing. Yeah. Not to quote the fashionable hashtags. I don't want to get in trouble. Yeah. So from all of these various leaders that you've obviously worked with and helped place executive assistants with over the years, are there any common habits that you think stand out among those really, truly successful leaders that you've encountered?
Yeah, I think they've gotten over their micromanaging tendencies, which most type A high-level successful people have. Understanding that there's usually more than one way to skin a cat, if you will. I think that I've seen good leaders, really strong leaders, able to have difficult conversations with empathy and sometimes being a little humble. So I see those aspects as being very positive in terms of not brushing criticism or critique under the rug, yet doing it in a way where you're emotionally intelligent enough to know that the person receiving this information needs to get the full picture and needs to really understand where you're coming from. And if empathy is part of that, it helps to have that conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think back to earlier in my career, the buzz phrase back then was constructive feedback, right?
Right.
But nobody really explained what that meant, did they? It was always just don't be mean seemed to be the main thing. But actually, I think that's what it really is by another name, isn't it? It's giving that feedback back. It's not being afraid of those difficult conversations, yet also not being that kind of aggressive, seek out the tough chat kind of person, and be able to do it in that way it's constructive because you're empathizing with them. You're explaining it in a way that they will take it on board without getting lost in the, oh God, I've done something wrong sort of mindset. And yeah, I think you're right. It's a really powerful behavior. Few more questions, a bit more specifically about leadership then. First one I find is always interesting, and that is, what's the biggest leadership lesson that you've learned from your career so far?
I think going back to, for me, it was building that muscle of being able to have those difficult conversations. That, when I said in the previous answer, comes directly from me having to grow and have those attributes, if you will. The other thing is, I for us specifically, it's we really lean into trying to have some patience. Understanding that when you're in a a sales or business relationship game, you have to realize that not everybody moves at the speed you want them to, and how you handle that can exemplify your leadership. As I was thinking about leadership preparing for this, leadership can be a tough thing to pin down. And I think it shows in a lot of different ways. But I firmly believe both in personal life and business life, being able to not shy away from difficult conversations is one of the key things to having breakthroughs and moving forward.
I agree. Yeah, definitely. I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about short term versus long term, doesn't it? And I think a lot of people, I've worked for bosses who've done this, where they just become almost paralyzingly afraid of that difficult conversation, of that confrontation that they think is coming, to the point that they'll just avoid it entirely. And they might think, and then in the short term, they're right, that they're avoiding difficulty, they're avoiding something unpleasant. But what they actually do really is they put it off. They make the person they're avoiding even more disgruntled and unhappy. And then in the long term, they're probably going to lose that person from their business. And if they're doing that on a strategic scale with everyone in their business, how long is it going to be before the business falls apart? So it's worth the short-term pain, isn't it, in order to avoid that long-term one?
Yeah, I say that, but then if you're at the start of creating your business and having that difficult conversation could lose 50% of your revenue, it's hard. It's not easy. Or if you're in your full-time role and you have that difficult conversation, you do have to realize that if you're not the CEO, you may lose your job. And are you prepared for that? And so when you connect livelihood with having difficult conversations, if you are not the top person and you need to have one of those conversations and it's connected to your livelihood, it becomes even that much more stressful.
Yes, you're right, of course. And I think that's where all of the other things that you were saying come into it, isn't it? It's about how you do the conversation. So if you can have it with that kind of the humility aspect and the empathy, and you can phrase it, particularly if you're not the top leader and you're having to have that interaction with a boss, you can phrase it more in a kind of, this is my fault or this is my issue, can you help me with it?
Right.
And that's certainly an approach I've always found quite useful for avoiding the more difficult outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And something else I find really interesting about the humility piece as well, and this has come up a couple of times with conversations I've had recently, is how that connects to imposter syndrome and the sort of the crossover between it. Because I guess one way of describing imposter syndrome might be extreme humility. Is that something you've seen a lot with people you worked with? Or
Stephanie and I talk about this all the time, imposter syndrome and who are we to run this business, or who are we to do what we're doing? And I don't know. I think being humble, having humility is, I think, a show of strength. And it's an encouragement to get more out of people and see where their head is at without clouding them with your opinion. And so being humble enough to keep your mouth shut and take in what someone is saying is really powerful. And then that gives you, as the leader, the ability to pull from that what you think is really relevant and hits the nail on the head, as well as pull from that what you think, in your opinion, may not be completely on point and why. It's an opportunity to really connect in a way. If, on the other hand, you say exactly what you're thinking and based on your experience, and really it would take someone a long time to change your mind, and you are the leader talking to a subordinate, you're closing yourself off to potentially good ideas and outside the box thinking. And I think outside the box thinking is really important, because you never know where it will lead.
Definitely. And I think that speaks to one of the big misconceptions, I think, about leadership. And another aspect of that as well is, if you're the one who, as the leader, feel that you've always got to have the answer, the pressure you're putting on yourself to always know that answer as well. You're not being fair to yourself either. Like, you're not being fair to anyone you're not listening to, right, as you've said. And then also you're putting so much extra pressure and stress on yourself when you could just have a conversation and find out what everyone else thinks and get half a dozen different answers to think about and decide on. Right. Rather than, I think that's one of the big myths about leadership, isn't it? Is that you're supposed to be the one with the answer. That's what being a leader is about. And it's just not. Maybe it was like 100 years ago, but it's not now.
Right.
Leads us into the next question, and you may have already answered it. What do you think is the biggest mistake that most leaders make?
From the seat of an executive assistant, I think that there's two things that we fight with a principal, and that is micromanaging. There, in terms of I want it done exactly this way when there could be 10 ways to do something, and the quote unquote I can do it faster myself mentality, where they're not getting the leverage out of the partnership and the extra time that gives them by those two aspects. The other thing that I would say, based on things that I have experienced and seen throughout my whole career, is a leader who leads from the perspective of fear. The leader who wants everyone beneath them to walk on eggshells, knowing that they could be let go at any moment, and who thinks that is a powerful motivating factor. Obviously, as I said, when it's connected to livelihood and work, fear can be a very motivating factor in the short term. I just think in the medium and long term, it's the wrong way to motivate and get the best work out of people.
I think it's still an excellent motivator. It's just, it motivates them to find another job.
Well, that too.
Which presumably isn't what the leader's looking for. Maybe it is sometimes, who knows? But
right.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, the micromanagement and the do it faster myself, I think we've all done that, haven't we, at some point in our lives? I know I have.
Well, look, Stephanie and I are in the process over the last couple of months of bringing an assistant on for us.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so handing things over and doing that is a really hard muscle to break. And we're in that process. What it is doing, though, is it's actually allowing me specifically to hand off higher level things that she is allowed to take a crack at and get that jump off point started. And, Jeff Bezos has a good analogy is around there are two different questions. There are, one-way door questions or two-way door questions. And the two-way door questions, speaks to that there are more than one way to skin a cat, or there are usually more options. So if you walk through that two-way door and it doesn't work, or it wasn't optimal, you can walk back through it and go back. And so he doesn't worry about those decisions. But the one-way door is a decision as a company. When you walk through it, there is no going back. And those are the decisions that he wants to be involved with and really think about and contemplate in a deep way before making that move, because there is no going back. And so if you can use that framing to think about what you do and how you do it, it may free you up to hand more things off, delegate more, and lessen the micromanaging voice that's in the back of your head.
Yeah, I really like that analogy, actually. I've not heard that one. And obviously, considering the source, it clearly works. Hard to argue with the results he's achieved, isn't it? Regardless of your view on billionaires. I know
listen, I think, I don't know. I would hope that if Jeff was here, he would say, yes, but luck is still a part of it, persistence, playing the long game, all of that. He started with books.
Yeah, and even then people were skeptical, weren't they? Oh, it's never going to replace the bookshop and all that sort of thing, but it did, effectively.
Yeah, it was an easy way to create the back-end infrastructure needed for the company that nobody saw or thought about when he was doing it. One of my really close college friends worked for Amazon in 96 and 97, and he told us of, him going in and packing books, standing next to Jeff during the Christmas holiday, in the lead up to get books out the door. And, you didn't see that on the front end. You didn't know that top executives were, behind the scenes packing books, and everybody in the company had to do it. But that was in an effort to build that infrastructure to deliver anything to your door within 2 days.
Which actually speaks as well to another aspect of really good leadership, which is never expect anyone else to do something you wouldn't be prepared to do yourself.
Absolutely.
And clearly he lived by that to an extent. I'm sure he doesn't anymore, but
no. And I don't think Andy Jassy does either. But it's just a different season for the company. And to that point, Stephanie and I started Pro Assisting to fill ourselves up with clients so we could put food on the table. And then you grow from there. But I am still serving 2 clients in our 6th year. That is, I think, potentially going to be changing over the next 6 months. But just because the business has grown and we're going into different areas as well. But being able to say to either a prospective client or a prospective assistant, I've done this. I've worked in this role with clients like this, and I can either say to a prospect, this is going to work for you, or maybe this isn't going to work for you. And I can say to an assistant, this is how we do it. And we know it works, but you have to take ownership of it, and you have to, understand the obligations that you're signing on to. And if you can, you're going to be successful. At 85% of life is showing up on time. You can show up on time. Hey, that's 85% of the game. And then if you throw a positive attitude on top of it, you're at 90. Percentages are arbitrary, but
indeed. But you're also going a step further now, of course, by taking on your own assistant. So you're practicing what you preach from the other angle as well.
Yes, she's fantastic, and we're trying.
And so if there's anyone out there, maybe one of the listeners are looking for a career change, what advice would you give to anyone who is considering either working with or maybe becoming an executive assistant?
I think in terms of working with, Harvard Business Review says that when you're starting a business, one of your first hires should be an executive assistant. I don't know if I fully believe that, because I really, especially for us, I need to see a certain level of revenue to justify our minimum expense of $3,000 a month. So, but I do think that it can be one of your first hires, especially if you get that big contract in and you need to service that big contract, but also go win more business. That's where the executive assistant role can really come into play. It is about looking at it as a true partnership. It's a very intimate relationship, and the quicker you see it as such, as opposed to potentially having a more adversarial relationship or a push and pull kind of relationship, I think the better that partnership can be. In terms of becoming an executive assistant, if you're coming out of college and you have a very strong desire to work in publishing and a reception job opens in a publishing company, take it. Really the reception role is the kind of starting stepping stone, or an admin assistant role is the starting stepping stone to working your way up the ladder and becoming an executive assistant. And two things are going to happen. Well, three. Either one, you're going to find out you don't love the publishing world and you'll leave, but then you'll have experience to get a reception role in some other industry that you may be really interested in. The second thing that could happen is you could get promoted to an office assistant or an administrative assistant or a reception lead, and then a marketing coordinator job opens up and someone in the company comes to you and says, you're always smiling, you're always happy, you always have a can-do attitude. Why don't you apply for this role? I think I would like to work with you. And then the other thing that could happen is that you could move into that office admin role, that administrative role, that executive assistant role, that senior executive assistant role. And then you get the tap on the shoulder from the CEO and says, my assistant's leaving. Would you consider working and taking her spot or his spot? And when we're talking to companies and advising companies on their operation strategy and their assistant strategy, I'm always a big proponent of using the assistant role in whatever fashion as a proving ground, as a potential springboard. Because hiring from within and taking someone who already knows the culture, already knows the ins and outs of the business, and putting them into a role and then backfilling that assistancy is much easier than going out and trying to hire a higher level role of someone who's brand new and coming in.
As you were talking, I was reminded actually that that's how I started my career. I took an admin assistant role in an office, and it happened to be an aerospace company because I was interested in aerospace, and my whole career went from there. So you're right, it does work. Can confirm.
Yeah, I did it in entertainment. Yeah, I did it in entertainment, and I just ended up, my 20 years in New York City was really, well, the first 15 was really about leveraging the assistant role to chase bigger dreams outside of the office. And for me, that was writing screenplays, that was directing short films, that was playing music. So, that is also a way of looking at the assistant role as a way to build the resume while you're still figuring out what you want to do.
Indeed, yeah. I don't know about you, but I was definitely not that conscious about it. It was just, right industry, I can probably do that job. I'll try that.
I wasn't very conscious about it either at the time, but no, after 10 years, then I was like, yeah, this is actually how I'm doing it. And then, but you roll over 10 years later and you're like, wow, I have a career as an executive assistant. Just how it worked out.
Let's imagine we had a time machine. If you could go back in time to that start of your career, what would you tell your younger self?
I would say in your 20s, don't get caught up in title or compensation. And, if you're making $35,000 a year and you're working 80 hours a week, you may start doing that arithmetic in terms of how much money you're making per hour in your head. And in your 20s, I would say, don't do that. The 80 hours you're putting in is with people who will show you the way, who will transfer their experience to you. And I think it's hard when you're at that age, especially if you've put 2 years or 4 years into higher education. I think it's sometimes people look at that and say, I got to make my money back from the money I spent on school. And I really think your 20s are about gaining experience to where you can really speak to a role, an industry that allows you to move up the ladder And that would be my advice is to collect experience, even if you're just fetching coffee for someone, as long as it's in that industry that you do want to learn about, or it's with a company that you do want to immerse yourself in. The stories of the assistant or the receptionist who make their way and move their way all the way up to the CEO seat, 15 or 20 years later are always fascinating and always something worth celebrating. But what were they doing in their 20s? They were getting coffee. They were getting lunches. They were, walking the dog. Just is what it is. So really don't shy away from a potential experience just because it doesn't pay you what you think it does, or the title isn't what you think it should be.
I think that's valuable advice, actually. Yeah, definitely. And something that I personally didn't get right probably in my career.
Hindsight is always 20/20.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think you're right. I mean, the biggest value of those kind of roles is you're going to overhear everything that goes on. You're going to see all the stuff. You're going to really learn about the business and the industry, and to an extent that you probably won't even realize either until 5 or 10 years later, and you're looking back on it and thinking, oh, wow, look at all the stuff I've learned by starting where I started. So yeah, really, really good advice. I like it.
Leadership Heroes.
Time's flying, so we must be having fun. Last question. I know you're going to find this controversial, so I'm looking forward to see what your answer is. It's called Leadership Heroes. And the question is, if you had to pick one person, they can be alive or dead, past, present, real, fictitious, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership, who would that person be and why?
Well, a little behind the scenes for the audience. I did know this question was coming. And I've thought about it, and I could sit here and say Luke Skywalker, or I could say Superman, or I could say Abraham Lincoln, or Martin Luther King Jr. But the way that you presented the question was with the word perfectly. And I'm a bit of a contrarian. So I came up with Walter White, who is the lead character in the series Breaking Bad. And he's a little bit of an anti-hero, and his leadership could be questioned greatly. But when you start thinking about motivations behind the scenes and why he does what he does, in the end, it's all about his family and his health. And so he's the one I came up with to shine a light on the fact that nobody's perfect. And I'm sure Abraham Lincoln had his imperfect moments. So it's more about kind of putting yourself in someone's shoes and understanding that you may not see the whole picture. And when we look at people, imperfect people like Walter White, who's leading from a position of family and health, it becomes more clear around the motivation and the why, even though he's doing illegal activities. I'm not suggesting anybody go out and do illegal activities. I'm just using him as a framing device around how I think about leadership and how it's not a black and white thing. It is a shade of gray, like just about everything in life.
That is such an interesting answer, I have to say. And particularly as a contrast to the four names you started with. Yeah, really, really. I mean, I understand and I like the logic behind it. I'm not sure that I necessarily agree that that's what his motivation was all the way through. It definitely was at the beginning. It probably was at the end. But there were definitely moments where you could see his ego coming out, and he was making it all about himself, and he was kind of forgetting why he got into this in the first place. Which again speaks to the imperfection, doesn't it?
Yeah. And when I was coming at it thinking, let me throw David a curveball here. Let me come from outside the box. I was thinking about the beginning, the impetus. He had the expertise of chemistry and what was going on in his world that would push a high school science teacher to do such a thing. And that's where it went. But you're absolutely right. I need to rewatch the series because it's so good. And that anti-heroes kind of can almost take over the zeitgeist more than the perception of a perfect hero or leader. So, but point taken. Absolutely.
Yeah. No, you're right. And it's funny because you mentioned Superman at the beginning as well. I find in a lot of ways Lex Luthor is the more interesting character. Superman just gets a bit boring, doesn't he? Like, there's no real shades of grey in his morality, and it's just like, right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Whereas Lex would occasionally do the right thing, sometimes by accident.
Right. Right.
Well, that's been a very enjoyable conversation, Ethan. Thank you so much for your time. If any of the listeners would like to learn more about you or Pro Assisting, would you like to point them towards website or book or podcast or any of the above?
Yeah. On our website, proassisting.com, you can learn about our service. There is also a page there about our book, The 29-Hour Workday, a high performer's guide to leveraging your EA. It's really an instruction manual, which I think listeners may find interesting if they're either considering support or wanting to make sure they're getting the most leverage out of that partnership. And then I'm on LinkedIn under Ethan Bull, very active there. Happy to connect with anyone. Happy to have a chat and go through any operational issues or things that you're thinking through. I'm always a great sounding board for that, and I'm happy to help in any way I can.
Lovely. Well, thank you again for your time. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a lot, David.
Ethan, I love that conversation. Thank you so much again for your time. Listeners, if you would like to learn more about Pro Assisting or get in touch with Ethan, learn more about what he does, I've put his website and a link to his LinkedIn profile in the episode description. So click on one of those links and reach out to him. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you and have a chat. And if you'd like to learn more about leading with integrity, if you'd like to get access to our exclusive online leadership community, specifically aimed at new managers working in tech-driven environments to help you with the challenges that you face in that role, then pay a visit to this website. It is www.leadernotaboss.com. Again, that link is in the episode description, or if you're listening to this on the podcast website, then there will be a button there somewhere with a link as well. Please do join me again next week when I will be interviewing another excellent guest. And in the meantime, thank you again so much for listening. Thank you to all of you who have very kindly left such nice reviews for us on Apple Podcasts of late. And yes, I will speak to you again next week. Be a leader, not a boss.